Go. We're doing this together. All right, and then I'm gonna share our beautiful presentation here. And then as I'm doing this, I just welcome everyone to turn their cameras on. And I'm gonna go through some house rules in just a few moments here, but I want everyone to feel comfortable sharing their voice today. As we know, the world is going through some crazy times, so we really, really appreciate you being here live for the hour. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and press record to the cloud, and I'll get us started. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Chat and Learn here with PowerToFly. My name is Mariella Marie, and I'm super excited to host today's chat. I've been chatting offline today with our guest speaker, and I'm super eager to hear what she's got to share. Nicole, who runs this program, told me that our guest speaker is often talking about engineering with empathy, and I just color started shooting out of my ears. I'm like, I can't wait to hear what Josie's got to say. But I just want to first start off by saying thank you everyone for taking the time out of their day to chat with us today. Everyone has been muted upon entrance, just so everyone knows, but you're more than welcome to unmute yourselves. Actually, I'm going to sound like a broken record by the end of this chat. I really want to see you all participating. Please turn your cameras on if you can. I know that we are living in the age of multitasking, but I just, really would ask if everyone could at least participate in the chat box. We've got some beautiful questions here that you all have submitted offline. So if you see your question that is coming on the screen, or if you have something that you dreamt about last night and you want to bring that up in the chat, you have the power in this hour. So with that said, if anyone has anything they want kept anonymous, you're more than welcome to write to me privately, just so that our guest speaker can be present and doesn't have to toggle between the chat box and with the screen here. And then the last thing I'll say is that this is being recorded. So again, please practice presence if you can. You don't need to take notes as we're speaking. You can rewatch this video on PowerToFly. And then you'll get the rewatch email with a lot of cool links here that we'll talk about today. I've said enough. I just want to mention also, if you're just joining us, please drop in the chat where you're calling from so we can see where you are in the world. I'm calling from Buenos Aires right now, originally from Los Angeles. Our guest speaker is in California, in South Bay, so she's in the Valley. We've got some folks on the line. Let me see what you all are dropping in the chat here now. I'm gonna put you all on the spot. Please drop in the chat now where you're calling from. Awesome. So we've got Israel, Boston, Argentina, Connecticut, Mexico. Hey, Hannah, Connecticut. Awesome, great. So, the power of digital community is key, especially now. New York, I see you. Before we hit this whole global crisis, we were doing this at PowerToFly, and it really just filled my heart to see that people were tuning in from all over the world. So I really appreciate you all joining. Ecuador, another Buenos Aires, awesome. All right, I've said enough. Let's jump right into meeting our guest speaker for today. I'm not going to read what's on the screen. I'm going to ask Josie to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to know PowerToFly, and what you're excited to speak with us about today.
Yeah, so I'm Jessie Haynes. I'm the Senior Director of Platform Engineering at Tile. And so, I have been working in the tech space for 20 years now. And in early 2018, I actually almost left the tech industry after working at Apple and just feeling burnt out and tired of the challenges that women in tech face. And I almost went and started my own small business. But realized that if I left the tech industry, I was going to become a statistic. 56% of women leave tech after 10 to 20 years. And I really could not become that statistic, knowing the fact that tech is impacting all aspects of our daily lives. Like if I think about my career, 20 years ago, tech impacted me a lot less than it does today. And yet, technology is not really addressing the needs of women and underrepresented minorities. And so, if we don't have diverse teams, which is what we're going to talk about today, we can't create technology that's truly inclusive for everybody. And so, it really got me to come back to tech under my own rules. And I, was going to join a company that I worked on interesting tech because I really still love technology. I got my first computer when I was 5. It was a Commodore 64 back in the 80s to date myself a little bit here. And I played with computers since, and, loved technology. So didn't want to leave, right? And so I was like, I'm coming back under my own rules, working somewhere where I can work on passionate, interesting tech, but also work somewhere that really cares about diversity and inclusion. And so when I went to join Tile, I actually talked to our CEO and said, hey, if you want me to be your platform engineering director, I also want to lead diversity and inclusion and make sure that this is something that's important to you. And so he told me, hey, I'm married, I have 2 daughters, and I also have 2 sisters, and I have no brothers and no sons. So I'm constantly surrounded by women in my life, and I want them to succeed in the future. And I've told my wife that I want to make Tile the best place for women to work in the Valley. So I would love for you to come lead these efforts. And so that's why I joined Tile. And, that's what really also inspired me to really start talking about this and really, be a voice for keeping women in tech, getting underrepresented minorities, places in the tech industry, and really trying to create a community where we can talk about the challenges we're facing.
Absolutely. I was just responding. Our chat box is blowing up. Everyone is loving that you had no fear. I'm sure you had a lot of fear as well. When we say that, I think that really puts things into a corner. How do you approach a fearful situation, not being consumed in a negative way by your fear and saying, you know what, I'm not going to become a statistic, and I think that's so important for people to hear nowadays, especially with all of the things that are going on in the world. We've got people raining your praise here in the chat. Someone here says, Hannah says, oh my gosh, we started right away with lots of reality. All of this is so true. Happy you decided to stay in the tech area and make the effort to help the diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So as you all see, we're going to have a really, really great discussion. You have submitted some awesome questions offline. We're just going to take them one by one. I always say a great chat is, if we stay on a couple of questions for the whole hour, that means that you all really, really want to dig in deep there. So we aren't going to rush. We're not going to run through just for the sake of, getting through all of the questions. So in that situation, if you do find that one of your questions is not being put up here on the screen, feel free to take yourself off of mute or drop it in the chat box, and we will flag that question right away. Thank you, Josie, for being just such a badass already. I'm super excited to hear what you have to say in response to these questions. So let's just take them one by one and let's jump right in here. So how are you advocating for diversity in your organization?
So, I think this nicely ties in with my story, right? And so, when I joined Tile, one of the first things I wanted to do was start a mentoring program. And I had actually run and started Women at Siri because when I was at Apple, there was a woman at Apple, but I felt, it was once a month, there was a meeting where somebody did a presentation, right? But you couldn't really have conversations about what was really going on. So I started Women at Siri to really create a place where people could have real conversations about their struggles and challenges. But I really wanted to start a mentoring program. But the VP of Siri at the time told me he didn't believe in mentoring. And so we couldn't start a mentoring program. And so when I joined Tile, starting a mentoring program was the thing I was going to do. And so we did. And I've now done 3 rounds of it. We usually have between 60 and 70% of the company participate. Almost every single exec participates in it. And it's been super impactful. We've had people be able to switch roles within Tile to do it. And, I've heard, and since I do all the matchings, I usually make sure that, the women and underrepresented minorities get paired with, our execs or people they really want to get paired with. And so, some of our women are getting paired with our execs and really getting to learn about different aspects of the business and talk to people who they might not have gotten to talk to on a regular basis, right? But mentoring obviously is just a small part of the whole diversity diversity and inclusion piece. And so I actually really partner with Lissa, who's our VP of People. And so she's obviously very super passionate about this topic as well, and loves the fact that I care so much about this. And so, I really think about diversity and inclusion in two pillars, right? There's the hiring pillar and all the aspects around hiring and diversity and inclusion. And then there's the culture of belonging pillar. And how do you create an inclusive culture? Because that's really, and that second one is really where the tech industry has been failing. So the tech industry has been spending billions of dollars on diversity and inclusion and has been working on, trying to hire more diverse candidates. But if you look at the numbers, they're not going up. And it's because it's just a constant cycle of people leaving tech because there's no inclusive cultures of belonging. And so, when I look to advocate for diversity at Tile, I looked at it across all of those lenses. And so we over the last couple of years, we've been, working on improving, our processes, right? And so the big thing I think with creating that culture of belonging is it's not just about, hey, you have an ERG. It's really about what are your practices and policies that reduce and eliminate bias.
Well said, well said. And yeah, we've got some people in the chat praising you as well. And I just, I love that you have divided into two pillars, and it makes so much sense. If you don't feel comfortable, you're not going to stay. And I always give the visual of, imagine, so we say like making space at the table, right? And it's like, it's one thing to like make space at the table and then like hope someone just walks up and sits down at the table. It's another thing to, put a sign and say, we're looking, I'm selling my house. I put the sign in front of my house, but I go back inside and, maybe people come, maybe people don't. And there's another step that is actually what you're saying would be more beneficial is if you go and you make them feel comfortable, and maybe that takes some hand holding, and maybe that brings about, some different things that haven't happened in the past. And I agree with you that we have a lot to do in order to keep people feeling comfortable and making sure that they can share their voice. So thank you, Josie. They're lucky to have you. And I'm so happy that you didn't leave tech and that you're able to mentor people in this way. I'm just going to flag some things that people are saying here in the chat box. It feels like people are just using ERGs and other things for face value, coming back to performative allyship. And someone else here has written, why is it so hard for tech companies to hire minority candidates? Is there a shortage of qualified applicants, or are qualified applicants being overlooked?
Yes. And so I feel like I've heard it's a pipeline problem so many times, and it's not really a pipeline problem, right? And the candidates are out there, right? And so I actually was just reading this great article about how Lissa Wardell, who's the only Black female CEO in the Fortune 1000, she boosted her company's minority leadership by 50% in 4 years. And she did it by promoting people who had potential into those positions from within, by providing them the training they needed to be successful. And the reason, and I think I read that article and was like, that is amazing, right? Like, let us focus on promoting and supporting people from within. But I think that potential thing is so important too, right? So many people promote men on potential, but then women and minorities have to prove themselves to get that role or to be promoted, right? And, again, like, one of the things that Moore said is correct. Women aren't applying because if they see a million requirements, they're only going to apply for a role if they think they meet 100% of the requirements, right? And so there's this great book called The Better Allies Approach to Hiring by Karen Catlin, which really does talk about, some of these things. And she really says, you should have 5 things at most as your requirements for a job. and really focus on what are those requirements and what are the things you can like train somebody to learn while doing the job, right? And so, you know, so many people are like, oh, we have to lower the bar. And it's like, this isn't about lowering the bar. It's about actually figuring out what is the real expectations and understanding, you know, training is important, right? You can't, you know, I think it's fascinating. You know, nobody's going to get hired at like McDonald's and not go through a training program, right? Yet we hire, you know, engineers and promote people to managers all the time and put them through no training and just expect, oh, hey, these people are supposed to be smart enough to pick this stuff up. Well, that's kind of BS, right? Like you need to train people. So.
Yes. So again, our chat box is blowing up, and I'm just going to invite again everyone to turn their cameras on. Feel free to take yourselves off of mute as well. I'm going to just flag some of the things that people are writing here in the chat. So create the pipelines. All companies can do this. Someone else here has written, Lemur has written, I think one of the problems is that women are just not applying because they do not feel qualified enough for the job. Nicole says, I love the potential thing. Ramona writes back to Lemur, are they being overlooked or not selling themselves enough in quotation marks? And then Lemur writes, women are less, for sure, women are less confident for some reason than men. Before I get into that conversation, I'm just going to also invite them to unmute themselves and while Josie responds to some of their questions.
I mean, I can say from personal experience, I mean, being a director of engineering, and I was struggling really hard to find women and to keep and as you mentioned, Josie, it's not just the hiring part, but also keeping those women around and making sure that they feel like that they belong and they feel like they have a great growth path at the company. And I noticed that women just don't apply because they are not filling all the checkboxes in the job descriptions. And sometimes we just alter the job descriptions. We just remove some of the, because, we're trying to reach obviously everything under the sun, and we try to trim that down so more women will apply.
And I think kind of along those lines about, why women are less confident, it is tied to the fact that as girls, we're raised to be perfect, right? And so Reshma Shijani, the CEO of Girls Who Code, has a great book called Brave Not Perfect. And it really talks about, how as a society, we encourage girls to be perfect and pretty and polite and, be nice, right? Be the nice little girl at the playground, right? You don't encourage the little girls to go get messy and roughhouse, but the boys get encouraged to get messy and roughhouse. And so boys end up learning at a much younger age how to negotiate, right? How to actually deal with conflicts. And this actually ends up leading to this lack of confidence that women end up having later on because they never had the opportunity to defend themselves or speak up for themselves.
Okay, thank you for dropping this in the chat box, Andy. She's quoted and has also dropped the link here. Men are confident about their ability at 60%, but women don't feel confident until they've checked off each item on the list. The advice, women need to have more faith in themselves. That's Andy's advice. Thank you all so much for being so involved in the chat box. Again, let's keep this going.
Wait,
Josie,
just really quick,
yes,
just really quick, it wasn't my advice. I mean, I agree with the advice because I'm struggling with this as well, but it's the advice of this website that I found where, as I remember, I heard a ridiculous number of what percentage men feel confident at and what percentage women. I was just Googling to see if I can find it, but not my advice, but I agree with it. I don't want to take credit for something that I didn't create.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for sharing your voice. Josie, do you want to? I know you probably have a bunch of studies and case studies that you've been sharing with your mentors or mentees. Do you want to?
I mean, yeah, this is definitely the big one, right? And there's actually, I think there's a lemonade story in Brave Not Perfect, which I think is very telling. And so the story goes, the researchers have two rooms. One room is of boys, like these are like 8-year-old boys, and the other room is of 8-year-old girls. And they have lemonade that they give all of the kids, and the lemonade has salt in it. But the researchers tell the kids, hey, this lemonade's great. Have some, right? The girls drink it and they just gulp it down. They don't say a word about the fact that this lemonade is horrible. They just sit there and they all drink it. The boys, as soon as they sip it, complain and are like, ew, this is gross. And, I think it's a very telling story, because what if you're that girl at your first meeting at work surrounded by a bunch of men, right? Like, what's going to encourage you to actually speak up and say that the lemonade was salty, right? And so, it's about building that confidence from a much earlier age.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to flag one more thing. Ramona has been writing in the chat box in response to not selling themselves enough, in quotation marks. She says, I definitely do that, even though I know better. It's like the argument against affirmative action. White men have benefited from their own form of affirmative action forever. And then later on here, she writes again, it requires getting the people who hold power to unlearn the behaviors and actions that keep women and underrepresented minorities from succeeding or moving up. Did you want to chime in on that, Josie?
Yeah, and it's true, right? And so one of the things I talk about is, it's really the middle managers that we need to convince in this whole process. Because even if the exec team comes in and says, hey, we care about diversity and inclusion, we think this is awesome. I mean, they're obviously hiring their managers, but at the end of the day, the people really hiring the team is the underlying managers, right? And so if your management leadership layer doesn't really believe in diversity and inclusion and creating a culture of belonging, you're never going to get there, right? And so it is about changing, managers. And again, it's because we don't train our managers, especially in the tech industry. We promote our best technical engineers to leadership and management positions with no training and magically expect them to know what their job is, right? I was talking to one of my friends who, I'm mentoring, and she recently has become a manager, and we were just catching up. I haven't talked to her in like 5 years, and we were talking about, getting into management, and she was like, yeah, for my first year, I thought my job as a manager was to make people happy, right? Like, that's what I thought my job was. And it wasn't until I really figured out, no, that's not my job. My job is not to make people happy, right? I need to actually make things effective, and implement change. And so, I think, and it's also tied together, right? To create these cultures of belonging, you have to have well-trained managers and leaders who understand the importance of, empathy and including everybody, and, how to have successful meetings where everybody can have a voice, for example, and things like that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to call out this very important point here that Andy has dropped in the chat box, because I often find that this happens too, especially in the world of tech. Let me just reframe, let me pose her comment into a question, and then I'll read her comment. How do you call out in a way that won't get you in trouble lip service? For example, what Andy has written here. It's often lip service when you look at the board of directors, almost all white, with maybe one person that looks a bit different, woman or non-white.
And I think obviously this depends on your team and where you are on this journey. And so actually we'll share a story from, obviously, with everything that's been going on with current events, diversity and inclusion has been a huge topic for us at Tile recently. And we've really been thinking about, hey, how do we implement, corporate social responsibility? And during one of our all hands, a couple all hands ago, CJ, our CEO, made a comment, and I actually wasn't there, but I believe it was something along the lines of, hey, we're trying to do all that we can. And then some somebody actually in our organization actually spoke up, and she said, you know, I don't think we're doing all that we can. Like, I think there are more things we could be doing and we could be focusing on. And so now actually the two of us are kind of working together on a corporate social responsibility plan that ties in with D&I. But, you know, I think sometimes it's, hey, if you're in a corporation where, you know, having a voice is something that's, you know, appreciated, sometimes it's literally just calling it out in a respectful way, right? Because a lot of times people don't realize, you know, what's going on, right? Or they think they're, you know, really taking action, right? But then they realize, maybe this is being more performative, right? And it's really about asking the right questions and not blaming somebody, but again, coming from a place of curiosity, right? And I mean, even me personally, I have to say the last couple of months have been a journey for me in increasing my empathy, right? With everything that's been going on, I have personally been learning more about, you know, anti-racism and things like that, and have realized, hey, I needed to have more empathy. And I think about this stuff every single day, right? And so it makes me realize, like, if I think about this every day and I still am seeing where I can experiment and grow in my empathy, other people like have that journey to go through as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you everyone for participating. I just want to continue to say that I have not had to sound like a broken record in this chat because you all have been super active and I love that. I'm going to shout out another thing here that's in the chat. Ultimately, the white men in power have to be willing to give up their power, for example, their positions. Since that rarely never happens, we have to work within the systems we're already part of or create new ones. Do you want to comment on that, Jessie?
Yeah, and so, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. So there's a Melinda Gates is doing an Equality Can't Wait initiative where they're looking for proposals for how do we get this equality thing addressed, you know, much sooner than a couple hundred years from now, right? And so, you know, I've been brainstorming with some women about this, and you know, we were talking about, yeah, how do we both convince the leaders to make change, but and not have to wait until like a new generation gets there, right? And so the things we were really thinking of is it comes from both sides, right? It's about getting like the millennials and the people who are joining organizations to really speak up and be like, hey, I'm not going to join this organization if this isn't something that's important, right? And so I think that's how we impact change is we have people with voices say, hey, if you want your employees to be happy, you have to support these sorts of initiatives, right? And I think it's creating a workforce that is fighting for those things.
Absolutely. And I can say also from my experience, I mean, I have friends who are male, who are white males, who work in creative industries, I would say, and they, you know, they're millennials that know that diversity is important, yet, you know, they'll come to me like, I have all these, you know, white guy designers and photographers in my studio, and I like, you know, I need another perspective. And I'm like, you know, well, it takes more than wanting. And I know you have good intentions, but it takes, you know, you have to put the work and the time in. So I love that now, you know, everyone is echoing that sentiment, and, you know, hopefully we can see action in it. It's not just that it's trending, you know, as we see some people are just, you know, slapping these hashtags on or like saying that we are, but then they don't give the budget for it, for example. And then you run into these, what Andy said, lip service happening. And, you know, that kind of mismanagement, as you're saying too, with not training management properly to then, you know, practice what you preach essentially. So thank you everyone for sharing your opinions. I'm going to move on to the next question because I'm sure this next question will also get a lot of buzz here. So Diversity initiatives seem like big projects to take on, and we're all at max capacity with our bandwidth. Are there small steps we can take to start creating a more inclusive workplace?
Yes, and I think like this aligns so nicely with what you had just finished talking about taking action, right? And so, when I talk to people about empathy, I always encourage people, I give them a challenge. I say, set aside 15 minutes on your calendar for the next 2 weeks, every day, 15 minutes. And in that 15 minutes, be intentional about how you're going to either, increase diversity or increase inclusion for that day or increase empathy for that day, right? Or do something, learn something during those 15 minutes. And it's just like, it's about the small things. And so, pick an initiative to focus on and work on improving that initiative, right? And obviously it is all tied together, right? Like I said, if you bring in diverse candidates, but your culture is horrible, they're just gonna leave, right? So I really tell people, hey, focus on building that culture of belonging, right? A lot of companies right now, hey, we aren't hiring right now. And that means, hey, it's a perfect time to focus on creating that culture of belonging, as well as creating the policies and practices for hiring to be more inclusive when we do start hiring again in the future, right? And so, so what I recommend is, think about your company from an overview, right? Where is the place that you want to impact? Do you want to impact the hiring? Do you want to impact the culture, right? And then really break it down to actionable steps that you're going to do along those lines, right? And then it's also about, reaching out and talking to the other members of your company about the fact that you want to do this, right? So an example is when we started talking about corporate social responsibility, one of the projects that we're going to look at is vendor diversity. And so we're going to start sending out a survey to our vendors to see the diversity of our vendors before we hire them as part of the process. And so somebody in finance who I'd never talked to about diversity and inclusion before reached out and was like, oh, hey, I'm super involved in the vendor process, and I think this is super cool and would love to participate, right? And so now I have one more person that I know, hey, obviously she can't spend a ton of time on this, but hey, it's somebody else to lean on. And really, it's about everybody doing little things, right? We can all be leaders and behave, with empathy. Take the time to call out, hey, when we see in a meeting that, somebody's idea got appropriated or somebody got interrupted, like we can say something, right? So it's all about speaking up and figuring out what are those little things that you can do and realize, hey, you could create like a grand plan, but you don't have to get everything done right now, right? And so it's about figuring out, I tell people I manage my D&I just like I project manage any other project, right? Like it has a project plan, right? Like there's steps associated with it. I mean, I'm not geeky enough to turn it into Jira tickets or anything like that, but we do, like it is kind of managed like a project. Yeah.
I think that definitely is so important too. And I say this sometimes in a joking way when I say like, I know we're all involved in our calendars. You got to set some time to like practice empathy or an emotional intelligence activity. And it sounds so bizarre. It's like schedule time. Otherwise, a year, 10 years goes by and the same kinds of things are still happening. And so, I really do actually encourage everyone to take that into consideration, to really plan, like treat it as a project management thing for you. And then I would also say something that has helped me is to, when you are building that culture of belonging and you already have, diverse members on your team, to schedule time to review and talk about, when we used to always have this like great emoji debate, like working on the marketing team at PowerToFly, and it's like, I just feel like emojis are just a little behind, and then, every update they come out with something that represents more and more people. And how do we identify, and, how do we use these emojis, and how do you as a company use those emojis when you're trying to show, a culture of belonging to your client, or to, the person that is consuming your product. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you have any tips or tricks, or do you agree or not agree?
Yeah, no. Okay, yeah, sorry, was unmuting there. No, totally agree, right? And so, I think it's about like, measuring what you're working on too, right? Which I think is really important with like picking initiatives is, taking the time to ask people, how is the diversity? Like, how do you feel? Do you feel respected by your coworkers, right? Do you feel you can bring something challenging up and have a constructive conversation about it, right? So a lot of companies do engagement surveys and don't realize that's the perfect time to include diversity and belonging questions, right? And really gauge how your team is feeling, right? And, especially now with everything that's going on in current events, I think it's also really important for managers to be taking the time to be having those one-on-one conversations with their minorities who might be impacted, right? And just not forcing them to speak, but just saying, hey, I'm here to listen if you need somebody to listen to and really understand their struggles, right? And, so many people are struggling, right? I mean, we've got, my Black employee friends are struggling with the challenges going on, with everything going on with immigration. My friends who have H-1Bs are struggling, right? And people are going through people are having, mental health struggles with the burnout of working at home, right? Like, so many people are having, so many different challenges that it's so important for leaders to really be taking the time to really be asking their employees how they're doing, not just at the work level, but like at the personal level too.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. All right, so our chat box is a little quiet now. I know we're hitting you all with some heavy stuff, but please feel free to continue on in the chat box. And if this is your question, please feel free to come off mute or drop in the chat box so that Josie can dive in deeper here. But let's go with this next question here. Is there a way to measure how successful the initiatives we already have in place are?
Yeah, so I mean, I already actually started talking about this, right? But one way is definitely expand your engagement surveys to also include, diversity and inclusion initiatives, right? If you're looking at hiring, right? One of the things we did is, look at the diversity of our current team based on, how everybody identified, and looked at gaps and be like, maybe these are the areas we need to focus on for hiring, right? Like, hey, we did a good job getting more women in, but hey, we weren't as effective in getting, more, Black or people of color in the team, right? So how do we change that, right? And I think you have to look at the numbers and try to measure as much as you can, right? Obviously, especially on the recruiting side, it is hard, right? Because it's hard sometimes to bucket people into the different groups. But a lot of the hiring software now actually starts asking those questions for you on a voluntary basis, right? So leverage that data. You might actually, your like HR team might have the data already and just not be looking at it, right? So, take the time to analyze what data you have, and try to set objectives and goals that makes sense for your organization. And what I mean by that is everybody's organization is in a different place in their diversity and inclusion journey. And a goal that might make total sense for a company that's completely bought into D&I might come off to the employees of a company that's just starting on the D&I journey as totally crazy, right? And so I think it's also really respecting the fact and realizing, hey, you might be really slow and you might just be starting in your D&I journey, but hey, it's great that you care about this, and you start showing like the small steps, right? Like this is not a sprint, right? This is going to take months or years. Like this isn't like going to be solved in like this year, right? Like this is a year-long project of like, how do we get more inclusivity, and how do we ensure diversity and inclusion in all areas?
Absolutely. And so I love that you said this isn't a sprint, even though there are things that you mentioned that can happen immediately. How do you not get blinded by, I know everyone is in their own journey with D&I, but like, we live in a culture, and the marketplace really influences the way, that we look at numbers and that we look at, the financial part of it. And so how do you advocate, even though people are saying, to avoid lip service again, how do you advocate that this is worth it, even though it's going to take some time, and then to, really book that in as you go along?
So again, it's, there are great business cases for diversity too, right? It's not, and so when you have diverse teams, you actually usually end up having more profits, and you actually come up with better products. I actually used to have some numbers about this with like women on the board and stuff, how much your like productivity and performance increase. But there's business justifications to all of this work, right? And honestly, it's about reminding people that it is a marathon, right? And reminding people constantly that we do need to continue investing in these things and continue having the conversations of why this is important, right? And yes, that might feel like a struggle, but then on the other hand, right, if you wanted to like work on like some really important technology, wouldn't you be doing the same thing, right? Wouldn't you be constantly saying, hey, this is important, like let's work on this right now, and be constantly bringing it up, right? And so I feel like D&I is the same thing, right? You need somebody who's advocating for it and reminding the leaders, hey, you haven't thought about this recently, like you need to think about it, right? And have somebody who's willing to call it out, right? So.
Absolutely. I love that you're saying that. And Nicole here has dropped in the chat, every marathon begins with one step. That's really important to remember. So, if anyone is having trouble advocating, this is actually a service that I'm offering in these times. I am a trained performance artist, and I do a lot of different things in marketing and PR. But the one thing that I love doing in my own world and then sharing with others is how to free our voice so that you feel comfortable with speaking your truth and holding your boundaries and all of that. And I know that this is a crazy time, and a lot of people are holding in what they have to say. It just kind of gets trapped in their throat, or maybe it makes people anxious, or it's like very uncomfortable conversations. So please connect with me on LinkedIn if you're interested in freeing your voice, because one thing that I would hate to happen is that everyone inside is rooting for this to happen, but then it doesn't come out and then we get stagnant. So I'm just going to read here in the chat box. Lemur has written, what works for me is being persistent, keep advocating and doing the work. Absolutely. And Lemur has done great things. So, again, finding mentors and people that, look like you or have the same, interests as you, which in this case is D&I, and to ask, can we have some real talk? How do I do this? So don't be afraid to ask people who have been in similar situations and who might have more authority in different parts of the workforce. So thank you for that, Lemur. Let's move on to the next question here. Okay, again, we have about 15 minutes. So if you have not shared your voice yet, now's the time to shine. Feel free to use the chat box or take yourselves off of mute. I'm loving the energy on this chat. So thank you everyone for participating. Okay, so what happens when a company wants to focus on diversity, but does not have the budget to do so? I know we talked a little bit about this, but did you want to dive in deeper here, Josie?
Oh, yes. And so, you know, I think you get creative, right? I think that's the answer. And if it's something you care about, you can make things happen, right? And so Tile, like a lot of companies, is struggling with COVID-19, where, you know, something that is sold at retail stores, and a lot of retail stores aren't, you know, open. And so, you know, I have a very limited diversity and inclusion budget. But I really said, hey, what is the things we need to focus on? And so I can prioritize the small amount of budget I do have. And, you know, what can we do? Well, hell, there's so much training online that is free. And I just take training and adapt it. Like so I've created like a lot of our own training for our managers and our team. And then leverage stuff that's out there. The Smithsonian, for example, came out with this amazing resource called Talking About Race, which really has people really think about the journey about how to be able to talk about race to their kids, to other people. And, you know, you can start a book club, right? Like, and discuss challenges, you know, pick a book that, you know, talks about some of the things you want to focus on, right? What are the other one is, you know, what are the policies and practices you can start putting in place that cost no money, but would improve diversity and inclusion? And so here's some examples. There can be a lot of biased language in job descriptions, and that can be one of the things that discourages women and minorities from applying to jobs. And so, hey, you could say, before we post a job description, we're going to take the time to review our job descriptions for gendered language, for example. You could also say, hey, the recruiting team, before it sends any of the resumes, is going to remove the names on them so we don't have name bias on our resumes, right? Neither of those two things cost money, costs a little bit of time, right? And so, yes, I do spend time where, you know, if there was more budget, most likely I would have spent less time on it. But, you know, hey, if you, but my company allows me to spend the time on it because they know it's important, right? And so I really do think it's about being creative and really in looking within and figuring out, hey, are there policies and practices we can really start changing to help inclusion?
Okay, so I got a private message here. Maybe you've already answered this, so I'll let them know. Please, the person who wrote me privately, let me know if you need to go deeper. But what trainings do you recommend HR to implement?
So, you know, I was listening to a book the other day, and I really liked something he said. So it was the hard thing about hard things, which is mainly targeted at CEOs. But something he mentioned was, you know, as a leader, you should actually be creating like the expectation training, because as the leader, you really need to be setting those expectations. And then you can work with HR to create the specific training on specific skills that you need to increase, right? So maybe you want a leading with empathy class. Well, as a leader, unless that's been some of your passions, that's not something you're going to be an expert in, right? But you can set the expectations and say, hey, as a leader, I expect you're going to have one-on-ones with your employees every week, and here's why, right? And really kind of providing, you know, the value of it.
Awesome. So thank you. You have hit the nail on the head here. So we don't need you to dive in deeper with that question. I'm just going to flag some of the things that are in the chat box now before we move on to the next slide. So here we have, let me just catch up here. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, it's really heartening to hear from folks who are willing to do the work, even though it's not technically part of their official job description. That said, I also hope more companies are willing to put money and resources, people, forth to carry out some of this work. Did you want to reply on some of that, Josie, before I move on to the comments?
Yeah. And so, I mean, I obviously, yeah, I talk to Lisa every day, and I'm like, hey, I would love to have somebody to help implement all of these initiatives. But I also understand like the economic realities, especially right now, right? It's hard. And, and so I do think, it really is about somebody who, takes the initiative. But for me, it really is about yes, I don't have the budget, but I do, my coworkers and my leadership team knows, like, I spend time doing talks like this, right? They know I spend some of the hours of my workday working on diversity and inclusion initiatives and not, my platform engineering initiatives. And that is what is also needed, right? Is the fact that maybe it's not just the money thing, but it's about giving people the time to work on these things. And no, hey, I do spend like at least 5 hours a week, most likely, on, D&I related initiatives instead of, my quote unquote day job, but nobody at work complains about it, right? And so I think that is what's really going to be needed. I mean, but it's also not about forcing your underrepresented minorities to do this if that's not what they are passionate about, right? Like, I'm doing this because this is something I'm passionate about, right? But it's also not about pigeonholing people into doing this.
Absolutely, because that's a lot of pressure, and definitely, respecting people's boundaries is key there. So just in response to that statement that we had in the chat here, Andy wrote, or really just be less biased when promoting and hiring. Lima wrote, I feel like we need to dive into it and also ask for the budget. Same as Josie, she took the initiative. The problem is when people are complaining and not doing anything. I think it is about taking a stand and taking action. And then Ramona commented to Andy, yes, that too, but it can take a lot of work to change company culture to ensure that when we do hire more folks from underrepresented populations, they are supported and can thrive. So I think everyone is just echoing, some of the things that you're bringing up here. I don't know if you wanted to comment on some of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it all lines up with what I was saying, right? It is about the small things on a daily basis, right? It's going to take time, and it is about speaking up, right? And taking the initiative, and everybody can do little things.
Great. And I have someone who's written me privately here. I'm here for my daughter. She is in the room off camera. I encouraged her to use her frustration to present a presentation to write a blog for her company. She's an intern and writes blogs often. Her manager loved the presentation and blog, but the owner of the company hated it. Should she drop it? He crushed her passion.
No, hey, if somebody crushes you, I'll actually give a story about the first big talk I gave was at Grace Hopper. I managed to I was like in shock that I actually even got a speaking role at Grace Hopper. And I was like, okay, so I gave my talk about retaining women in tech, which was about my story. And a couple of months later, you actually get an email with an Excel spreadsheet with all the feedback you got. And I got some amazing feedback. And I also got some very negative, hurtful feedback. And I remember reading this and feeling kind of crushed and being like, am I going to keep doing this public speaking thing? Am I going to share my story with anybody ever again? And I realized when you really piss somebody off like that, it's usually because you're making an impact. And also somebody actually told me something which I thought was amazing. She said, when somebody gives you feedback, your response is thank you. But that doesn't mean you have to accept that feedback. And you have to realize the place that that feedback is coming from. It might not always be there to help you, right? And so, you know what? If as an intern you want to publish your story, you should be going for it, because that's how you build your personal brand. You know, I've been talking to, so many, women trying to get into the industry right now, and with all the challenges going on, and they're like, how do I get a job right now? And I was like, differentiate yourself, build your brand, share your stories, put your voice out there on Medium, like share your message.
Absolutely. And I remember doing a chat with Lemur, and then she had a blog, I think, during that time. And then you started posting more. I started following you more. So Lemur, do you want to give this intern some feedback as well?
Yeah, I started my blog on health and fitness, which is an area I'm passionate about. And I remember that I felt very uncomfortable at first, putting some personal stuff out there. But then I felt like I'm doing this for me because this is something I'm passionate about. And I just started posting and making posts, and whatever makes you feel good and makes, and is bringing value to people, that's what you should do. You should follow your own truth.
Yes, we support you. Yes.
Yeah, we a lot of time worry about what people think. Shouldn't worry too much.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, everyone. So we've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to drop in the chat box here the mentorship program that Josie has here on PowerToFly, also her LinkedIn. I'm going to drop my LinkedIn here in the chat as well. Josie, do you want to take us out with some food for thought? Tell us a little bit more about this mentorship program that you have, and let us know anything else you want to just kind of give us some encouragement to face this beautiful, complicated beast that is, really inviting us to move forward in the world of D&I here.
Yeah, and so, like I mentioned earlier, it's about finding that small thing that you want to influence and impact, and really take the time to go do it, right? So set up those 15 minutes on your calendar, right? And definitely and realize right now there's a lot going on in the world that we can't impact, right? And so let's focus on the things we can impact and the things we can change, and focus on the positive things that you can do to make a difference, and realize, yes, there's sometimes going to be negative voices in the room, but that just means you're actually making an impact.
Absolutely. And with that said, thank you everyone for taking the hour out of your day to join us. I've learned a lot. I'm so grateful that everyone shared their voice today. So Josie, looking forward to see what you all do moving forward. I'm going to be checking you out as well on LinkedIn to get to know you a little more. And thank you everyone who's written in the chat their LinkedIn as well. Community is key. So, we're all going through some crazy times, and I would just encourage everyone to connect with like-minded people as much as you can to get support. I hope that the intern who is listening as well has felt encouraged by what we had to say today. So please be safe, take care of yourselves, and have a great rest of the week.
Bye. Thank you for organizing this and doing this. Bye.
Bye.